So I guess I'll say the welcome again. Welcome back to Tree Trooper Training Session 3. That being said, I'm going to turn it over pretty quickly to Brittany here tonight. Tonight should be a little shorter than it was in the last 2 weeks, which is pretty great, but I do have a couple reminders for folks. Make sure you're filling out your session assessments, which are on the Tree Trooper only page. If you're having trouble accessing that, just let us know and we'll get you the stuff you need for that. Feel like there's something else glaring that I'm forgetting, Gray, is there anything?
Don't think so. I think you covered it.
And I guess my only other reminder would be just to make sure to review the GIS stuff that we have up as pre-session material for next week. But I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brittany and we'll go from there.
Okay, just let me share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
I was gonna say, I'll take the silence as a yes. All right, so welcome back to the Tree Trooper training. As a reminder, my name is Brittany, and this is our 3rd out of 4 webinars that the Alliance will be presenting. Just got to rearrange some stuff on my screen here so I can see stuff. All right. So first we talked about tree and soil biology and learned that trees need light and soil, nutrients, and water to survive. And then last week we learned how to pick the right tree for the right place by learning how to do a site assessment. And then today we're going to talk about how to plant a tree and take care of it. So most of what we are going to talk about today is going to be coming from the Tree Owner's Manual. And that's the book on the right with the yellow star. And this PDF can be found online as well as the other Urban Watershed Forestry Manual that we used last week. And they still have a few copies available if you would like one. So just like a hard copy. So let me know, let Gray or Josh know, or myself, and I will mail that to you. So now that you have a site and you've done your site assessment and you have some tree species in mind, the next question is, what size tree do you get and where do you get them? There are 3 types of stock that we usually plant, and that's ball and burlap, container trees, and bare root seedlings. Each of these are really good options and they all have their pros and cons, which we're going to go through so you can pick the best type for your site. So the first up is ball and burlap. These are larger trees. They're grown in the field and cut right out of the field and then wrapped in a burlap and wire caging. We don't plant many of these just because they're really tall, they're really big, expensive, and very heavy. So some advantages of these ball and burlap trees is that they're dug out of the ground. So they're used to growing in that field soil. That the same type of soil that you're going to be putting the tree in yourself, and the tree is large, so you get that instant satisfaction right away. There's less watering for a ball and burlap tree because 90% of the root mass is actually cut away when it's dug out of the ground. The roots do grow back, but it is a little bit of a shock to them at first, which is one of the disadvantages. Cutting those roots can be stressful. Another disadvantage is that they can be really expensive. They can cost well over $100 per tree. They're very heavy, and you typically measure by caliper, tree caliper, which is the diameter of the trunk at about 4.5 feet off the ground. And some nurseries sell trees up to 6 inches or 8 inches or even higher. And that would probably be anywhere, close to 3,000 pounds, 4,000 pounds, because they're so large. And when they're dug out of the ground and have that huge root ball, it carries a lot of the weight. And then another disadvantage is that you can only dig out during the dormant season. So you're really limited to that spring planting season. And then we have container trees. This is kind of like a step down from ball and burlap trees. They're grown in containers in different sizes. So it's great because you can pick the size for your budget. And this is what we plant most of and what you will probably be planting because you're more of like an urban area. Some advantages of container trees is that they're grown in a container and then they're put in a bigger container when they get too big. So they keep basically 100% of the roots. They come in different sizes, so usually 1 to 25 gallon, and you can choose your size based on your budget or your site. And they're easy to move around. They usually don't weigh over more than 50 pounds. Some of the disadvantages are that they're not grown in that field soil. The nursery uses minerals and compost and very nutrient-rich soils, unlike the field soil. So it's going to be a shock when it's planted in the field. They require more water because they keep almost 100% of their roots. And they're typically root bound, unfortunately. They can be left in the container for too long or just not in the right size container. And this can be an issue if you don't fix the roots before planting, but we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So these are just some examples of container trees. On the left-hand side in that picture, those range from 3 to 5 gallon. And on the right, that's what we call a containerized seedling. They usually measure 3 inches by 3 inches by 9 inches, and they're really cheap. They cost about $3 a seedling, and they come in trays, so they're very easy to carry. You can walk around with like 15 of them. So they're really light, and then you can see that dark, rich soil that's in the pots. That's kind of the medium that the nursery puts in there. Yeah, so here's an example of that soil medium. There's a lot of pore space in there for water and air, which is really good. And the field that you plant the tree in is just not going to have this much nutrients. It'll probably be more compacted, so less pore space. So that means less water and less air in there. And it's also going to be a shock because the tree is used to being in this container. It's used to having everything it needs. And then the last type is a bare root seedling. These are just the roots that are dug out of the field. There's no soil like in ball and burlap trees. They're also dug out of the field, but they keep that soil with them. Bare root seedlings are exactly what it sounds like. They're just bare roots. They're usually grown really close together, and they are grown for about a year or two. So that seedling is probably about 2 years old, and they're usually packaged in bags to keep the roots wet because they can dry out easily. So you want to make sure you keep them wet and you keep them in a cool, shady spot. Maryland actually has a Maryland State Tree Nursery over in Preston, Maryland, and they sell only bare root seedlings. They're typically used in reforestation sites because they're super cheap and you can plant a lot of them at one time. You can buy, because you can start buying them in bulk. So if you buy 1,000 loblolly pine from the Maryland State Tree Nursery, it'll probably only run you maybe $300 to $500. So they're pretty cheap. Some advantages, like I said, they're usually cheap. They're sold in bulk, and they don't require a lot of water because they have a really small root system. Some of the disadvantages are that they're not usually prime for urban or like suburban area plantings, unless it's, well, really, they're not really prime for urban plantings. They can get mowed over and you can't see them at first because they're so small. And they also need shelters so they can be seen and protected from deer. And they're dug out and planted when they're dormant. So usually March 1st to about May is when you're going to want to plant these seedlings. They're usually dug out of the ground, at least at the Maryland State Tree Nursery, a little bit before March. So you can only plant these during the spring. Some out-of-state nurseries, like the Virginia Department of Forestry, I know they sell bare root seedlings. If you wanted to do something in the fall, you would have to find a nursery that would sell them in the fall, but it's not really typical to plant this type of tree during the fall season. You would rather stick to like a container tree would do better in the fall. So there are several different places where you can get trees and shrubs. Nonprofit organizations offer them. A good example is Environmental Concern on the Eastern Shore. They sell a lot of wetland plants. If you're doing any like wetland restoration or anything like that, they're a really good resource. And then government nurseries, they tend to sell bare root seedlings. I mentioned the Virginia Department of Forestry and then the Maryland State Tree Nursery in Preston. That's actually called the John S. Ayton State Tree Nursery. And there's also private nurseries that you can visit. And then the Native Plant Society has an up-to-date list of where to find native trees and nurseries and any plant sales that are going on. And you always want to try to plant native because that's what the wildlife and pollinators are going to prefer. And you don't want to plant invasives because they tend to take over an area. I did look into the use of cultivars because I know we got a question on that last week. And if you're planting in a super harsh urban setting, I would suggest cultivars just because they're more resistant. So if you're just planting in like a neighborhood or a park, that has some maintenance going on and they can be really cared for, I would just plant, the pure species. But if you're going to be in a very harsh environment, I would suggest the cultivars. So now that you know what you want to buy and where you're going to get it, I really suggest that you get under the hood and check out the stock at the nursery. They're usually grown in mass quantities and they're grown close together. It's really up to you to investigate the quality of the tree. The nursery is going to put whatever out. So you should really just check the stock that you're buying. You're going to want to make sure that they have a full crown and a nice central leader. That top branch, we talked about that central leader in the very first webinar and how they kind of control the tree. So you want to have one strong central leader. You want to have nice looking bark. You don't want any cracks. And the trunk should be centered in the pot. And there shouldn't be more than 4 inches of soil over the roots in that pot because that can suffocate roots because they need to be able to breathe. So this is a seedling or a containerized tree that we purchased. And you can see here that it's got a damaged root collar. This may heal over and compartmentalize, but disease may also get it. You don't really know, and you don't want to buy something like this if you can avoid it. Unfortunately, we didn't check this one out too hard, but hopefully it pulls through and you can see it's sprouting because it's stressed out. And if the main trunk dies, then those sprouts will take over. And then you can see the one tree in the middle here. Hopefully you can see my arrow, but right there, it's got that bend. It may fix itself because trees add wood where it needs to, but it also may not heal. Just look for defects because you really want to just get a good start. And this yellow arrow right here shows the root collar, and that's the area between the stem, the trunk, and the trunk and the roots itself. And it's where the trunk tapers out at the bottom right here. And this is something that you want to leave above the soil. And it's not always like this when you get them at nurseries, but I'm going to say it over and over again. You'll probably be tired of hearing it by the end of this, but you really want to keep this above the soil. So this tree looks fine at a distance, but you can't see that root collar. It just goes straight down. It doesn't taper out at all. The nursery tends to pile up this mulch and organic matter, and over time it really just builds up. So when you dig 2 to 3 inches down into there, you can find the root collar. And it's not good to have the root collar buried like this. The wet bark leads to pathogens and rot. Only root tissue can really survive this wet, moist condition. And if the roots are too deep, they may not be able to get the oxygen they need. So always want to find that root collar and keep it above ground. And now that you selected the trees from the nursery, it's time to bring them home. And wind can really hurt a tree. So if you have an open truck bed or a trailer, you're going to want to make sure that you wrap the leaves and the branches to prevent any drying out. You can do this with a towel or a sheet or a tarp. And then secure the tree and tie it down. You don't want it sliding and moving around, and make sure nothing's rubbing it. So just check like the hard surfaces and the tree. You don't want it rubbing up against any wheel wells or anything you have in a truck bed. You can always use carpet or something to pad that area, but you don't want any rubbing. And then once you get to the site, you can store the trees. If you have container trees, you want to keep them in a shady spot and keep them watered. If you have a ball and burlap tree, you can wrap that root ball in a tarp to keep it moist. You also want to keep them out of the sun. And then basically the same thing for bare root. Keep the roots wet. You can put them in a bag or a wet mulch or wet newspaper, and you just want to keep them in a cool, shady spot. So basically for any type of stock, keep it shady, keep it cool until you plant it, and keep the roots wet. And then you also want to make sure that you're carrying the tree correctly. This picture shows the right and the wrong way to move a tree. You really want to hold the container, and you don't want to hold the trunk. This reduces the stress and the likeliness of breaking any branches. You can see here, this person is holding it by the trunk. This is what you do not want to do. And then this person here, they're holding it by the container. So this would be the appropriate way to hold it. Again, this is an example of something you don't want to do. Do not hold it by the trunk. This person should be grabbing it by this container. When you hold it by the trunk like that, you can put a lot of stress on the tree, and you also might break some branches. So you definitely want to avoid that. Again, just holding it by the container, this person holding it perfectly. And then once you get to the site, you can prune critical branches only. And I'm just going to say that again, you're only going to prune critical branches. There's no need to prune a newly planted tree other than the critical branches. In fact, it could kill it. It's better to prune a tree 2 to 3 years after it's planted. If you prune too early, you reduce that leaf growth, and with no leaves comes no food, and it can't grow. It's already stressed enough trying to get established, so only prune the critical branches. And when I say critical branches, I mean any broken branches, any dead ones, or if you have multiple leaders, you're going to want to pick the best leader. These are some pruning tools. Bypass tools are better because it's a cleaner cut. The blades pass each other like in scissors instead of crushing it like the traditional pruners. And a hand pruner is really all you're going to need when you first plant that tree, just to prune those critical branches. Hand pruners usually cut up to 3/4 of an inch. Loppers can cut up to 1.5 inches, and then hand saws can cut 1 to 4 inches. And we don't recommend bow saws. They're kind of bulky and they can't really fit between branches. So hand saws for things you can reach, and then pole saws if it's something taller. But for planting purposes, you're only going to need that hand pruner to prune the critical branches. And this is a branch collar. This is the thick, you can see the blue arrow, which points to the branch collar, and it's the thick tissue supporting the branch. That's where the meristems are. We talked about meristems in the first webinar, and they're in there producing new wood, and that's what is ultimately going to close the wound when you cut the branch. And if you cut that branch collar off, then the meristems won't be able to heal the wound. So you want to cut right outside that branch collar, right outside that swollen part. And you just don't want to prune it too close because it's not going to be able to heal itself. You also don't want to prune too far out. You don't want to have nubs, but it's better to have some sticking out than to have you cut into that branch collar, because it won't heal itself. So this tree has competing branches. It's got 3 competing branches here. And then this looked like it was the original leader. It looked like it died for some reason. It could have got broken or nipped by a deer. But in a situation like this, you're going to pick which one is you're gonna prune to have a good central leader. So you're gonna have to get rid of 2 of them. And I would just get rid of this one, and let this one take control up here. And then you're gonna cut right outside of the branch collar, so right where those orange lines are. And now we're gonna talk about how to plant. These are some planting tools you may need. A shovel for digging holes. You might need an auger if your ground is compacted. Typically, if you have a contractor, they will auger holes. So you might run into that. And then Matic, which is this tool right here. This is really good for digging and cutting roots. So that's always a good tool to have. And then a planting bar. Planting bar is what you usually plant bare root seedlings with. So you probably won't have to worry about that too much. And then I always like to have wire cutters and a knife. You never know when you're gonna have to cut ball and burlap or just wire ties. I always keep those handy. And then a mallet is good if you're driving stakes to support the tree or if they're for tree shelters. And then any materials you're gonna need for tree protection. And then there's site prep. So we already did our site assessment and we took care of any invasive species that we saw. Maybe we cleaned up some trash, we mowed the site. And you can see in this picture, it looks mowed, it looks taken care of, and it's cleared. But you can see that thick sod that this person is digging up right here. And that should be removed where you're planting the tree, because that's just extra competition and takes away water and nutrients from the tree. And this type of sod is typical in urban plantings, but it's pretty shallow rooted, comes up pretty easy with just like a shovel. Might be easier if you go out after a rain event or something like that. But you can see that person is just digging it up with the shovel, and then they made a nice little area for this tree. And it's really important to remove any tags and ties on the tree because this can actually girdle a tree. So you want to remove any wire and burlap from ball and burlap trees because that would prevent their root growth. And then you also want to find the root collar and remove the soil. And you might have to cut down in the soil. You can see in this picture, they kind of use a knife here and they use a scissors here, kind of just cut down to that root collar. You need to expose that root collar so it can breathe. Because the nurseries tend to add up that organic matter and it really builds up over time. And this is something you definitely want to address before you put it in the ground so that you can plant it to the right height. If you have all this on top, you're not going to be able to determine what an appropriate height to plant the tree is. So this is a tree that's about to go in the ground, but you can't see the root collar. It goes straight down. You're going to want to remove all of this before you plant it. So I would just, start here and dig away until I can find that root collar. You may cut some roots, but that's okay. It's more important to get the root collar out. And then once you take off the packaging and the tags and you remove the soil down to the root collar, it's time to determine how big of a hole you need. It's really important to dig the hole correctly and get the tree off to a good start. You don't want to plant a $100 tree in a $10 hole. So spend some time on it, really make sure it's dug correctly. And you can measure the height of the root ball, and that's about how deep you want the hole. Just don't bury the root collar. And then for the width of the hole, you want about 2 to 3 times the width of the root ball. If the root ball is a foot, the hole should be about 3 feet wide. And you want to have a big enough hole with loose soil so the roots can grow into it. So loose soil on the sides of the hole. I'll show you a picture of that later. But the bottom of the hole, it should be firm, just so if it's firm, less settling will occur because you really want to make sure that that root collar doesn't get buried. And you can pack it down with your hand or your foot. So this is a good size hole for the tree. It looks to be about 2 to 3 times the size of the container. It's a little hard to tell if it's at a good depth just because of the angle of the picture, but it's definitely, a good width. And then sometimes like a clay, if you have clay soil, it'll form like a hard pan. Right here, you can see it forms like a hard wall of soil. And that's really hard for roots to penetrate through. So if you see this, it's usually caused just by digging, with your shovel, but just use your shovel and break it up a little bit. It's just easier for the roots to expand outwards if you break it up. And you can see we broke it up in this picture, and it's just going to be a lot easier for the roots. And when you're digging your holes, it's always nice to have a tarp to put soil on. You want to backfill with the soil from the hole. And you can use a tarp, you can use a container, you can use a bucket. It's just super to help, or it's super to have that soil handy to put back in the hole, especially when you're doing a volunteer planting. And if you wanted to mix some compost into the soil, you could use the tarp as well, kind of just to mix it around before you spread it around your tree. And then before you plant the tree, you should deal with any problem roots. Container trees, like I mentioned, are usually root bound because they're grown in containers. There's really no issue with cutting the roots away. It's better to do this to fix the problem roots before you plant it, so you don't have to fix them, way down the road years from now. And you can use a hand pruner to cut any large circling roots. So you want to cut roots that have bends like this, anything that's just going to circle around the root ball. So you can use a hand pruner to get the larger roots. And then if you have smaller roots, you can just break them up with your hand. This is a 7-gallon container tree. You can see these really thick circling roots, and this can girdle a tree as it grows. If you just walk around your neighborhood and look at some trees and you look at the base of them, sometimes you can see big roots overlapping other roots, and that's a problem. So you want to avoid that in the beginning. So you're going to want to cut all of these roots away with hand pruners, and because you want them to go lateral, and the tree is going to put out roots really fast once it's planted, so it'll be okay to cut them. It's better to cut them now than have to deal with it later. So you can, if you have fine roots like this picture, you can just take a knife and kind of score the root ball on all 4 sides, and then do an X on the bottom. And then just break it apart with your hands. The tree is fine and the roots are going to be fine. You can see this container tree was really root bound. You can see this big root that was just growing on the top of the container, and all those fine roots below. So you would want to cut off that big top root, and then the bottom thin roots can be broken up with your hands or just cut away. You don't want to go crazy at it. You still want to protect the roots, but just break it up. Like you would do if you were planting tomatoes or something, you would just break up that root ball just so the roots, you want to encourage the roots to go lateral. But I don't want anyone to tear any plants apart. So just be gentle with it, but you do want them broken up. So this is an example of a huge ball and burlap tree. They're very expensive and hard to remove that burlap. And then once you remove that burlap, the soil tends to fall apart. So you also need to take the cage off and as much as the burlap off as possible, because you want those roots to expand. If you can't get all the burlap off, that's okay. It will break down eventually, but it's better to remove as much as possible. And please don't forget about any cages or wires, because that can girdle the tree over time. So this is a tree that's planted to the correct depth. There is something wrong with this picture though. You can see that this kind of mat has been left on here. It looks like we did cut it and put it back on. We may have been protecting the topsoil from heat or sun, but we're gonna take that off before we plant it. But this is a good hole for this tree. And it's always good to plant to the right height. And if you have a wet area, like a really saturated area, it's better to plant just a little bit too high than too low, because if the site doesn't drain well, it'll probably settle over time. And then before you know it, that root collar is going to be underground. So that's definitely something to take into consideration if the area is a little bit wetter. And then after you get the tree in the hole at the right height, you're going to want to backfill with the same soil and then water that backfill area. You're going to want to water every few days, just for establishment. And it's also helpful to mulch the tree. The mulch holds the water and eventually it'll turn into that rich organic matter. And when you're backfilling, you want to use the same soil that you dug out of the hole. You don't want to bring in a different soil. The tree is used to the soil from the container that it was growing in, and it should get established in the current field soil, because we learned from previous sessions that you should match the tree to the site and the soil. And when you put the soil back in the hole, you want to push it down, add some water, put some soil in, push it down, and kind of just repeat that process. You want to create a firm area and get rid of any large air pockets. Small air pockets are good, but if they're too large, they're going to dry out your roots. And this is a bad example of a planting, or this person planting this tree. You can see that this grass was left up here, this medium was left on top. You can see some of these large roots. I would want to double check to make sure that these are broken up and not circling. As long as they can grow out, that's fine, but you don't want them to circle. And they're carrying it wrong. You shouldn't be holding it by the trunk. They should be holding it by the root ball, or at least have one hand on the trunk and one hand on the root ball to support that weight. And then you can also just work the roots while they're partially in the hole. You can see this person is just breaking up these roots, gently just breaking up that root ball, and the soil is just going to fall back in the hole, which is fine. But just make sure it's going to be still planted at that correct height with that extra soil in there. And then this person is setting a perfect example while planting this tree. They're holding it by the trunk, but they're also holding it by the root ball. So they're supporting that weight. They're not putting a lot of stress on this trunk. And you can see they're also breaking up these roots before they put it into the hole. You can see these roots were growing probably around the container. They get pretty long here, but you can see down here how they're just broken up. So you want to break it up to look like this. And then should you use fertilizer or compost? I know we got this question last week. And we don't typically amend the soils because they're expensive and they require repeat treatment. But if you're planting on a small scale, maybe in an urban setting, one of those more harsher settings, and you have poor soils that lack nutrients and you have the time and the budget to amend the soils, I would suggest mixing in some compost over fertilizer just because it's natural. And then you should spread it out to the drip line, which is where the branches end. We call it the drip line because if it were to rain, the rain would drip off the edges of the branches. So you're going to want to mix it into the soil out to the drip line and mix it in about 3 inches deep. And you don't just want to add it to the hole. Don't just dump it in the hole. And I try to avoid even putting a lot of it in the hole, because if you make that hole perfect, the roots aren't going to want to leave. You want them to expand. So kind of mix it out to the drip line. And if you have, soils that don't have a lot of nutrients, you can also just mulch. A little slower, but over time that will break down. and add in that organic matter and some nutrients for the soil. So mulching is really good. It's an organic material, it holds water, it shades out weeds, it protects roots from temperature swings, and it can keep people away. It's just really important to mulch correctly. We don't want a sad tree. So sad trees have volcano mulching. This is bad because all this mulch up against the tree trunk adds moisture, and that can lead to insect problems and disease problems. Only root tissue that's underground can withstand these types of conditions. So you want to keep it away from the trunk, and we want a happy tree. So we want a donut shape around the tree, not piled up. You can see that root collar right there tapering out. So no volcanoes. Try to keep it donut shaped. And when mulching, we have a common rule where we try to mulch 3 feet in diameter around the tree, 3 inches away from the trunk, and then 3 inches thick. You don't want it too thick because the roots can't breathe. And then some common mulches are wood chips, shredded hardwood, and pine bark. All are really good, but you want to try to avoid dyed mulches because they are broken down slower because they're dyed. And they're often from recycled wood, which could be from old treated wood, which can harm the soil, bacteria, and plants and insects. So just try to avoid the dyed mulches. So wood chips, these are large chunks of wood. They're 3 inches to 5 inches long. And because they're bigger chips, they don't mat down like some of the others, which I'll talk about in a second. These also break down slower. So you don't have to replace it as much, but it doesn't turn into that rich organic matter that fast. And then it may contain pieces of leaves and bark, which is good because it adds those extra nutrients into the soil. Then you have shredded hardwood, another good one. It's super easy to find. The problem with this though is because it's shredded, it can mat down and knit together. So you're gonna wanna make sure that you break this apart. If it gets matted down, it can also repel the water. So you want to avoid that. Bags are sometimes heavy because they hold so much moisture. So that can be an issue if you're having to carry them with volunteers. Maybe get some wheelbarrows or something like that. And then worms break it down really quickly, which turns into the soil. So you're gonna have to replace it over the years. And then pine bark, this is the last one, and it's also a good option. It doesn't hold as much moisture because it's just the outside bark portion of trees. And it's also not going to break down that fast because worms don't eat it. But it's super light and easy to carry. And then if you have a slope, I wouldn't plant this on a slope because it's really light. It'll kind of just blow away. And then water, the most shock the tree is going to get, most shock the tree is going to go through is when you move it and when you're planting it. So the sooner you water it, the better. You want to water container trees if you can before you even plant them because you don't know how much the nursery was watering them. And then when you get them in the ground, you want to water over the root zone. Ideally about 1 inch of water over the root ball and just let that sink in. Then you can water before or after mulching, it doesn't really matter. If you do it after mulching, it's gonna need more water. And then I would just check the soil every other day. If it's a new tree, you just wanna keep it moist. And you're gonna want to protect your trees and shrubs from deer if you have high deer pressure, and even protect it from humans if you're in a high traffic area like a park or like an urban setting. The buds of the tree are very nutritious and a good food source for deer, so they typically like to eat them, and deer also like to rub up on trees. So you can use cages and shelters to help prevent this. They also prevent mowing damage. If you're not doing the maintenance yourself, You might have somebody else doing it. So it's always good to make sure the trees are visible. It can be through flagging, but you're probably going to need tree protection out there anyway. So that helps a lot with making sure they don't get mowed over. And then the larger trees get cages, and they're not permanent. They stay on until the deer can't really eat that top terminal bud. So I would say, 6 feet or so, 7 feet. You just don't want the deer to eat them. And then if you have a bare root seedling, or a containerized seedling, so one of the real small ones, you can use tree shelters. These are really cool because they act as a greenhouse. So typically the trees will have accelerated growth when you plant them. And then that left picture is a red maple, and this was planted bare root seedling, so it was only about 1 foot tall. And after one growing season, you can see it on the right, and it's 6 feet tall. Red maple is a really fast growing species, but that tree shelter really helps to increase the tree growth. And it'll stay on for a while, depending on how fast the tree grows, probably 4 or 5 years. And you should take it off when you can't fit 2 fingers between the tree trunk and the tube. If you leave it on for too long, moisture gets in there and it leads to insect and disease problems. But you also don't want to take it off too early because the tree could fall over. It's, like I said, it's often accelerated growth-wise, and it puts a lot of its energy into the crown, the top of the tree. So the trunk is a little bit more weak. So if you take that off too soon, the trees probably just fall over. So definitely leave them on for 4 or 5 years if you can. They're expensive. They range maybe $4 a shelter. But I think they're worth it. They really help with deer protection, and they protect, they keep them safe from mowers as well. And then just to recap the basics, the width of a planting hole should be about 2 to 3 times the width of the root ball. And you want to make sure that the bottom of the hole is firm and that the root collar is exposed. And you want to backfill that hole with the existing soil. And then you want to water the backfill area and add mulch in a donut shape around the tree. And it should be about 3 inches thick. And avoid any volcanoes. So you don't want your mulch touching the trunk. And then you're going to install any tree protection you need, and then stake the tree if it's needed. We don't really stake trees. They tend to not need them if they're planted well. But if you do put a stake on, make sure that you don't leave it on for more than 1 year. Because you want that tree to put on wood where it needs it and support itself. So try not to leave them on for more than a year if you can. And then maintenance. You can plant the tree perfect, but if you don't take care of it, it's going to die. You need to take care of a tree until it starts to establish, and that's about 3 years. You should water from spring to fall. A lot of big rural farm plantings, they don't really get water because we use bare root seedlings. They're planted very dense. But in urban settings, you're definitely going to want to water the trees. The urban areas are very stressful, they're hotter, and you tend to use a larger stock tree, so like container trees, and they have more roots. And then you want to make sure you maintain any tree protection, so you might have to straighten some cages. And then you're going to want to mow, just mow to reduce the competition throughout the growing season. So from spring to fall, I would try to mow. And then inspect the branches just for disease or pests or anything that looks strange. We can talk a lot about this, and I can show you. It's easier just to show in the field. And we're going to have a field session next month, so I can definitely go into more detail with maintenance. And then I'm just going to touch on pruning older trees. We don't prune new trees, planted trees. Like I mentioned, we only prune those critical branches on new trees. Any broken, diseased, or multiple leaders you would prune. And then you can really start pruning a tree after it's established, so about 3 years. And then winter is the best time to prune, just because you can see the branches, it's in the dormant season, and it's just minimal stress. We don't really prune evergreen trees because unless they're diseased, just because we like to keep that form. And it's really when you're pruning, it's a case by case situation. You never want to remove more than 25% of a tree's branches, and then you always want to prune to have one really good central leader. You want good spacing. You want good spacing between the branches, but you also want clearance between the ground and that first branch. And then if you have any weak branches, you would want to prune those off. And when you prune large branches, you should always use a saw if they're bigger branches, so like 2 to 4 inches. And then you should use the 3-step method. And this prevents the bark from tearing into that bark collar where that meristem tissue is. And remember, if that tissue gets damaged, the tree won't be able to heal. So when we do the 3-step method, you're gonna do an uppercut about 6 inches from that tree collar. And you're gonna go do an uppercut halfway through that trunk. So about to here. And then your second cut, you're gonna cut down. And that'll get all the weight off of that branch. If you didn't make this cut, this number 1, and you just cut number 2, you're most likely, because of the weight of the branch, all this bark is just gonna rip into the trunk collar. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So by doing the first cut, the second cut, and then just cutting the third cut, it's less likely it's gonna rip. The bark's less likely to rip just because it's less weight. Well, that's all I have for today. Homework's pretty simple. Just take a walk around your neighborhood. You know, if you don't live in a nice neighborhood, I guess you can go to a park and just look at the mulching on trees and any trees that have been pruned. Are there any volcanoes? Do you see any donut-shaped mulch jobs? I typically just see volcanoes. So take a look at the mulching, and then do you notice any incorrect pruning, such as topping? We typically see that under power lines and on crepe myrtles, unfortunately. So that's your homework, and that's all I have for today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brittany. That was great. I loved your saying of don't put $100 tree in a $10 hole. Never heard that before. That was great. All right, so I just wanted to remind everyone to put your questions in the chat. I've been collecting them throughout the session. So I'm going to start calling on people to unmute and ask their question. So first, I saw a question come in from Lauren. I'm sorry, I'm not sure which Lauren that was, but Lauren, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Is it the one about should you take the cage away?
Yeah, I think that looks right. Yeah.
Oh, because in my front yard today, the landscaper, actually, it was leaning at 90 degrees for a year. And then I kind of tested it and I put it at 60 degrees to see what kind of reaction we would get. And they actually replaced the tree. And when they pulled it out, it had the wire cage there. So that was interesting to see. So that just happened today where our landscapers did that.
And definitely when you're planting, you want to make sure that you don't miss that cage on any of that ball and burlap.
And then next, I believe I saw a question come in from Allison Milligan. Allison, if you wanted to unmute.
Oh, Allison, you're still muted. Sorry.
Thank you for finding that. I was trying to find it.
Okay.
I couldn't find her on the screen.
It's about the cultivars and how it was recommended we plant cultivars in urban areas. And I just want to clarify something. I'm sure you didn't intend to insinuate that we should plant plants that were cultivated to change the color of the leaf, like a pansy red bud. So I think what you were implying was that we plant things like a Durahheat river birch.
Yeah, so if maybe there's a cultivar that's more salt tolerant or something like that, that is what I mean. I did read a study where they showed that if they did change the leaf color of a cultivar, then the insects did not actually prefer that tree. So definitely don't plant something just for the flower color. I was more talking about just for resilience.
Okay.
Choosing a
That's fine.
cultivar for an urban
Okay,
site.
thank you so much, Brittany. And you're correct, because Doug Talamay's research has shown us that there are chemicals that are introduced when you change the color to, especially to purple, is the culprit. What's there? I know I had a couple questions, maybe. Oh, I guess those mulch discs, a lot of people really like them. So they don't inhibit growth, they inhibit weeds. So can you talk a little bit about, you don't encourage them, but I mean, they sell them at a lot of native nurseries. So especially for people that really aren't going to be maintaining them to the degree they should be. So
when you mean mulch discs, do you mean like weed mats?
yes, what you were showing there, where it's a circle with a hole in the middle, and you can remove it or you cannot remove it. And those are there as weed suppressors. They're just made of fiber that will decompose over time. So, and they do preserve water. They allow air in. They're not inhibiting anything, I guess, is my point.
I agree. I usually
I don't want to say, no, you can't use them.
I typically see them just at the nursery. I assume they're, keeping the soil out of the sun and just letting it hold the water. I would remove that when you're planting, because you want to see that root collar when you're planting. If you leave that on, you're not going to know. You may know, but you may not know where that root collar is if you still have that any type of medium on top. You could leave that on there. Like you said, I don't think it's gonna harm it. Just make sure, that trunk can expand, because you could see it was a circle, but it also had a cut through it. So you could slip it on and off.
Right, exactly.
I don't think it's gonna hurt it. My point was just, you want to see the root collar before you plant it, just so you know you're planting it to the right height.
Right, to take it off. And if you really want to, you can just put them in your compost if you don't want.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if I had any other questions. I'm not any more of my
Well-
questions. Someone else should go.
Yeah, Allison, I'll call on you if I see another question come up. So next I saw a question from Laura Adam. This one I would love to send to Josh specifically. Laura, if you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
Which one was it about?
The
heat
global
tolerant.
warming.
Yeah, so lots of the trees in my neighborhood are definitely stressed from the climate changing, even though, not everybody agrees with that. So is there any thought to making trees more available that could withstand a lot more heat, like a more southern tree?
Josh, you're muted. Oh, yep.
As we dive into this, you're going to want to take a look at our resilient species list. So that's going to be the palette, the menu that you can choose your plants from as you're developing your projects. They've gone through the Forest Service's ModFacts system, along with a few other things. And Brittany, I don't know how familiar you are with ModFacts, but it really comes down to figuring out how quickly a plant can, or a tree can adapt, if it can move geographically, that sort of thing. And then we've also run it through some revisions with local foresters and that sort of thing. For example, the bald cypress is on that list. Typically Maryland, especially in the coastal plain, is the northern reaches of that, but that is firmly on the list because that's something that as we do shift and see the climate changing, that will be very happy here. But that's definitely going to be something that you guys want to dive into. It's on the Tree Trooper only page.
Yeah, that was one of my choices because I can see we have a lot of wetlands and there's been a lot more standing water. So the trees that are there aren't going to last forever with having wet roots like that. They're not that kind of tree. So I was just curious because I know a lot of the data we use is historic, but moving ahead, that's not necessarily going to apply to our situation.
And then Laura, I think you had another question if you wanted to ask. I think it was about Bradford pears.
Yeah, you were talking about pruning the trees so that they had a main, thingamajiggy. But I know a lot of people don't seem to understand like suckers. So like the best example I can think of is Bradford pears. Like they get millions of them and the whole tree will come down. But other trees get them too. So it was just something we didn't mention. I don't know.
So when you're pruning a tree, you definitely want to take into consideration the form of the tree. So if it's like a multi-stem tree, it's going to have more than 1 leader. So like your river birches, they have more than 1 leader. So that's a situation where I guess they look like suckers, but they're just a multi-stem tree.
Okay.
Multi-stem shrubs too. And I guess I'm not sure what your question is about suckers and pruning. Can you just clarify?
Well, like if it's how would you know if it's a multi-stem or if you should leave them or if you should cut them?
Well, hopefully you're gonna know what you're planting when you plant it, so you're gonna know if it's a multi-stem tree or not. But that would be my suggestion. You would just have to look up the species of the tree and then prune it to match the shape. Sometimes you get suckers at like the base of trees, like that damaged container tree that I showed you. And that happens because they're stressed out. So they're trying to put up a new leader. I would prune those off in a situation like that.
Thank you.
And then next I saw a question come in from Allison Harkins. If you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, my question is it useful to, after a tree has been in the ground for a long time and it's established, but like maybe it's at the bottom of a slope and there's some dirt that accumulates, from getting washed down the hill around the root collar. Should you go back, even though the tree is established, and try to expose that root collar, or do you just leave it alone?
You can definitely go back and fix a root collar. If it's super serious, you might have to get like a lawn care company to do it. But one of the maintenance suggestions, like future maintenance, is kind of just like clearing around the root collar because you do want it exposed. So yes, you can go back.
Awesome. And then next I saw a couple of questions come in from Lisa Bender. Lisa, if you wanted to ask your questions.
You can't hear me. Trying to unmute, but you couldn't hear me say it.
We can hear you now.
Okay, I kind of forgot my question. I know I had one Can you remind me of the first ones?
Yeah, the first one was about a loblolly pine that you had planted.
Okay, I did a planting at our clubhouse, at our new clubhouse, quote unquote, with the scouts. And one of the ones we planted was a loblolly pine. And I'm looking at it now thinking that perhaps the hole was not big enough for it. It's very, very rocky, hard clay, sand mixed soil. It's looking stressed. So I didn't know if I can, or if it's possible to widen the hole after the tree has been planted in order to add some, amendments to the soil. They were planted like early November to October.
Okay, how big was the tree?
Yeah, I think it's about 8 to 10 feet.
Okay.
I mean, check the roots, but I guess I may not have checked it close enough.
It might be just stressed because it is a pretty large tree. Large trees tend to take some time to get established. You can add nutrients into the soil. You could just add some compost into the soil if you just wanted to spread it out to like, about 3 feet away from the tree. Well, don't put it up against the trunk, but work it into the soil 3 inches and then 2 to 3 feet away from the tree. If you're really concerned about it being girdled, like maybe you didn't break up the roots, you could try to dig it out, but in my experience, less is more because it's just going to go through a lot of shock. And I've planted a lot of smaller loblolly pine, and I've noticed for the first couple of years they tend to turn yellow, and I think that's kind of just like a characteristic of them. And I have seen them heal, but those were smaller trees, so I can't really speak for this larger tree. But I'd suggest adding some of the compost if you think it's stressed out, or just give it another year. It could bounce back.
So I can dig like around the exterior of the hole. I didn't want to disturb it because I figured it's probably got some roots going off somewhere.
Yeah,
So-
you could kind of just dig where you think the root ball is. Don't like destroy it or anything, but kind of just like dig in there and just see if the roots are circling. Then you could, go in a little bit more and fix it. But if they look okay for the most part, it should fix itself.
And that's standard for like all the trees and all the, and is it the same for shrubs?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Well, did I have a next question? Gray, I think I had.
You might have. I think I
Okay.
copy and pasted the question twice, so I
Okay,
don't know
cool.
actually if you
Got
had
that.
another.
But Josh, thank you for the one on the flowers and the changing for the colors. So I appreciate that one. Yeah, I had a lot of questions. I had a lot of thoughts. Oh, I know. I had another question about digging up a tree from or transplanting a tree, digging a tree up, say from a wooded area and then transplanting it into someplace. How do you dig it out? How big a hole do you go around your stem or your trunk to dig a tree out?
I've planted a lot more trees than I've dug out, to be honest. I would just a foot or two. I guess it would depend how big the tree is. If it's really large, you're going to want to go a little bit bigger so you can get the majority of the roots in there. But I don't really suggest transplanting trees, especially trees that you buy from a nursery and you put in the ground and then transplant them. That's a lot of stress. If you live near a forest and you see little seedlings popping up that are, a foot or two tall, those are definitely fine to move around. That's actually kind of fun. But I would just try to avoid planting if you can. That's my suggestion.
I was walking through my parents' woods and found like some beautiful mountain laurel and some beautiful wild azaleas that I was interested in transplanting, taking from the wooded area and bringing up here. I just didn't know how to dig them out.
Yeah, if you are gonna dig them, just make sure, if it's a bigger tree, just take some more of the soil and roots with it. but
Okay,
just be
Thank you.
cautious that it may not make it if it's too big.
right. Thank you. Yeah, they were short.
Okay.
Thank you.
And then next I saw a question come in from Mary Borland, if you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
I think what I was asking was, if you have a tree, an existing tree, and is it a problem, the roots, the soil has eroded and there's just roots on top of the ground, basically. Should that be, I mean, if you put mulch on, it's just gonna kind of wash away. So I didn't know if that's a problem. Is that a sign of stress or?
It's not really a problem. I would suggest mulching it. I don't think it's gonna, I guess it depends how big the tree is. If you use like a shredded hardwood mulch, those are pretty heavier. So they shouldn't blow away like a pine bark mulch would blow away. But it's not really a problem. I would be more concerned if it was standing water, for roots. But it should be okay.
Okay. And the other thing was, I was going to ask about the crepe myrtles that people chop up every year, and I feel like I have to do it because everyone else does it. But do you have to do that, or no?
No, you shouldn't top a tree. And a lot of people that are like, oh, I don't know if I should do that, they usually do it because their neighbors are doing it.
Exactly.
And don't do it. It really just takes away from the beauty of the tree. They do it just so it stays at a certain height. And it's really going to reduce the life of that tree.
Okay, I was thinking they did it so it would bloom more, but it really doesn't.
They just want to keep I'm looking at this one right out my window. I live in an apartment, and I came by and watched him saw that off, and I couldn't believe he did that. They just want to keep it small for landscaping purposes.
All right, then that's good news. I didn't know.
And then next I saw a couple of questions come in from Lynn Michael. Lynn, if you want to unmute.
Yeah, just one quick comment on crepe myrtles. I thought they were A, non-native, and B, didn't support any wildlife at all. So are they a good thing to plant or replace?
They're not native, so I don't suggest planting them. I know there's one right out my window, and
Yeah.
I know they're commonly pruned incorrectly, which is why I brought it up earlier.
Yeah. Okay, I had a question. I saw the diagram on pruning a branch and having the first cut halfway from the underside. About how many inches up would you say that would be from the branch collar? Like 3-4 inches or so?
For which cut?
The first cut, the halfway from underneath.
Okay, that will be about 6 inches from your tree.
6 inches. And the second complete cut would be another couple inches beyond that?
Yep, another 4 or 6 inches. There's no exact number. Your goal is really just to get that big heavy branch off, so it doesn't rip the bark.
Okay. And then the last cut, the third cut would be close to the branch collar, but about an inch away maybe? Would that be fair?
Yeah, that would be good. About an inch away from that swollen part, which is the branch collar. It's much better to leave a nub than to cut into that.
Understand. And then we have landscapers that use very finely shredded mulch, and it seems like it blows away and washes away and whatever. They do that because it's cheaper than chunk mulch? Or other advantages?
I'm honestly not sure which one's a little bit more costly. It could just, they might contract it out. They might have a deal with someone. I don't know. Shredded mulch, sometimes it's super shredded, but you can also find like a middle ground. And I suggest using, I don't know, I like shredded mulch. It holds a lot of water.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I certainly, sounds like the pine is not a good idea. Then the last note, I was looking at that protection cylinder around that very small bare root tree, but that wouldn't protect the terminal bud from being eaten by deer, would it?
So it does, for the most part. They're really on there to prevent the They're usually used on bare root seedlings, so we're talking a foot or two high.
Mhm.
And deer will walk around and they'll pull the whole tree right out of the ground. Those tubes help a lot more with rubbing issues because I've planted, 544 trees to an acre, bare root seedlings with shelters with super heavy deer browse. And you can go to every shelter every year and the deer has nipped it off right at the top. So they will nip it. They come, I think you can get them you can get them to 6 feet tall. I don't know if they make a 7-foot tall one, but they are pretty tall. So if you do have a lot of deer, I would get the taller ones, but they really help with deer rub.
And then probably protect against lawnmowers and people walking by and, okay, thank you very much. Got it.
Yeah, and they also, voles are a big problem. They like to come and they're like little beavers. They just take the trunk right off. So the tree shelter, you kind of wiggle into the ground and that'll help keep the voles away too. Forgot to mention that.
I didn't realize voles were that nasty.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right, next, Annie, did you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I think Brittany answered part of it, but I just would like to see if she could elaborate a little bit more on amending compacted urban soils if you were planting the tree. And I think you did mention that you should, amend those soils, but and did you also mention how long of a maintenance on that amendment should occur? I guess that's where I didn't quite get here.
If you have compacted soils or soils that don't have a lot of nutrients, you can add in that compost. That's going to be a quicker fix than if you just add like mulch. Mulch will also help with the compaction over time, but that does take time to break down. Just keep in mind, if you are using compost, you're going to have to keep going back. And I would still pick a tree that can withstand compaction. Because if it's compacted now, depending where it is, it could still be, like if it's a park setting, it could still be compacted 20 years from now. And I don't think you're going to be out there putting compost down in 20 years.
So is there a specific list that describes that? The trees for for compacted soil?
Yeah, the book that we used last week, the Urban Watershed Forestry Manual, that has a chart in the back and it'll go through native species and it'll tell you how tolerant it is to compaction. They also include salt. That's a really good resource. I love using that book.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, and that resource is also on our Tree Trooper only page.
Yeah, I looked at it. I remember looking at it now. All right.
Awesome.
And can I just make a cheap plug about our mulch campaign that I'm working on with the
yeah, that would be great because there's
Master Gardener.
a question
we're
about
actually looking at the issue of mulch and particularly mulch volcanoes and developing a series of education efforts to educate people on proper mulching techniques. So I was pleased to, we're in alignment with what Brittany is saying, and we just go into a little bit more detail on the technique and explaining the actual technique and also how to go about mitigating the mulch volcano itself, because depending on the size, how long it's been there, you might be able to do it or you might have to hire professional help to actually, get rid of those root systems. So, and we're in the process of expanding the Baywise section of the Master Gardener's work to get in a little bit more detail on mulching, because it is a huge issue and it's not worth planting trees if you're not gonna mulch them properly so that they can get to live and grow and not have a lot of disease and problems. So anyway, that's my cheap story on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. Next, I saw a question come through from Gavin. Gavin, if you wanted to unmute now.
Yep. Hi, everyone. So I just wanted to wonder, I was wondering about a possible allelopathic effect of pine mulch. And then I think there was another question about, should you use freshly chipped trees as mulch, or, does that have any effect? So they're kind of similar.
We've used pine mulches previously, and we've never really had any issues with them. Like I said, I prefer the well, if you're talking like pine bark mulches, we've never had any problems with those. I prefer just the shredded mulch, just because it holds the moisture better, and breaks down really quickly.
And how about the age of the chipped? Because the chipped trees are, you can often get them delivered for free, and it's just a ton of mulch. So they're very tempting to use because, yeah, they're free.
That's just going to break down a lot slower. That's really all I can think of versus, freshly chipped and, stuff you find at like the nursery yards and stuff. It's just going to break down a little bit slower. It'll be less time before you get all the nutrients and the organic matter.
All right, and then next I'm gonna throw it back to Allison Milligan because you have a couple of questions. Let me know if you want me to remind you.
Sure. So the one question was if I haven't used a lot of protection for trees. I haven't had the pleasure of planting around a lot of deer. So, but I am starting to do that with some people. And I just wanted to know one of the least expensive ways to protect. Where would I get that material? Do you just go to Lowe's, or you go to, is there some source that would, and it wouldn't be like the $5 one that you showed. Is there something less expensive? Just the wire mesh, I guess.
So if you want one of those like tall green shelters that look like tubes, which it sounds like you don't, but we usually use a brand called Tubex. You can order that online. I know Forestry Suppliers has it. I've seen it on Amazon a few times. But if you're planting a bigger container tree, which I'm assuming is what you're going to be planting, you can just go to Home Depot or whatever hardware store you want, and sure. You just get I do 2 stakes on either side of the tree, drive those in first, and then you can just get a roll of like metal caging, and you roll it out. You make it into a circle. You can use like ties to make it, like a cage circle.
Sure. And I could do that also with blueberry bushes. I'm assuming it would work with blueberry bushes. Yeah.
Yeah, you could do that with blueberry bushes. I would be more concerned about, depends if you want to eat the berries or not. I'd be concerned about the birds eating the berries. For that, I would use like a fruit net, but
yeah, I don't know netting. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, just gets, unless it's like a wire. Because otherwise snakes and birds get caught up in it. So, but yeah, okay. So there isn't like some simple, some cheap store. I just was curious if there was a known cheap source for getting wire mesh for protecting, just some lesser, for people that don't have a lot of money, basically, but they want to protect their new trees. That's what I'm getting at. Yeah. Okay.
Unfortunately, I don't really know any discount stores. If you plan to do a lot of plantings, it would help to buy the supplies in bulk if you can. That would reduce the price over time. But
right, maybe that's what I'll just do. The other question I had was, so I had a tree cut down today. It was actually a snag. So it was a 3 trunked tree that should have had a leader, but it didn't. So at first we girdled it at the top. I don't know if that's called girdling, but we girdled it so it wouldn't collapse. And then years later, it started to get to die. So then we cut it, but we left it as a snag. So it's been about 15 feet. And today we had to get it removed because it actually is crumbling and falling apart. So now we have all this fresh tree. But I remember someone telling me that that's really not something I should be using for mulch because it's gonna be decomposing and using up the nutrients. So do you comment on that?
What I told the other gentleman, Gavin, I think it was, that is just gonna decompose slower. I don't really know if it would be using up nutrients per se, really just because it's decomposing, but I guess, the worms and the insects and all of that.
I'll do a little research. I remember hearing that I shouldn't be using it around new plantings. So
Yeah, I'll take a note on it too, and ask around to see what other people think, and I can touch on it next week.
Okay. Thanks, Brittany.
Awesome. And we just have about 4 or 5 more questions left that I've seen. So want to be cognizant of everyone's time. So next, I saw a question come in from Diane Hill. Diane, if you're still here. Yep.
If you're planting trees to extend the riparian buffer zone along a stream, do you still mow under the trees or do you just leave it natural to kind of fill in the space?
So I actually used to work for the Maryland Forest Service, and that's all I did was plant riparian forest buffers with bare root seedlings. And we do mow for the establishment of the tree only, typically. So that's about the first 3 years. Until it gets established, you really want, that tree to be high enough away from all the grass competition. But if you're going through some sort of program, like a cost share program, I would just double check, any regulations they might have. You're probably not. I'm just thinking about experiences I've had in the past. But I would say mow for the establishment, definitely. I don't think you're really going to get great success if you don't. Maybe like twice during the growing season, but I wouldn't mow after that.
Okay, thanks.
And then next, I saw a question come in from Mary Mulvihill.
Yes, thank you, Brittany. I have tons of volcano mulching in my community, and I feel like the volcano mulches are on top of volcano mulching beds. So if you can imagine like a huge bed of mulch, and then the trees are almost volcanoed on top of the beds. So to tackle that problem, I've watched a few videos where sometimes they say you need to get professionals in and use an air blower to actually get down deep enough without damaging roots. I'm just curious if there's some best practices or steps to start taking to take down the volcanoes, basically.
I would just, dig away and see where that root collar is. If it looks like you have some exposed roots, really big roots, like the roots have grown out of the ground and almost, into that mulch, you could get a lawn care company or like a tree care company to take a look at it. That would be your best bet, or at least just like, it's hard to say without actually looking at it.
Sure. So as you're digging down to pull away the mulch from the root collar, if you start to really hit roots that you think you're going to be damaging, if you go further, call in the tree professionals, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because we had that question earlier, if you could, clean off the root collar, or if you saw roots, some erosion, if that was okay. And that typically is okay. But, I either would want to look at it or have like a second opinion. I just don't want to, it's going to be a case by case situation.
Okay, thank you.
And then next, Rich Pillock, if you want to ask your question. All right, we'll move on to the next one, and if Rich comes back, we'll give him another chance. Diane Ray, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. I just expressed general frustration with the mulch volcanoes, which I've already done my homework 10 times over because I can't go out walking around my general area without seeing so many mulch volcanoes. I just kind of feel like landscape companies need to be reined in. I don't know if there's any regulation that's possible for them, but they seem to be, perpetuating this as a normal way to take care of trees. But besides that, that was just a kind of a commentary. Is it worth it if you are focusing on your own property or a church property or a park or et cetera, is it worth the time, energy, and effort to dig out and remove a very mature non-native tree in order to plant a native? And the example I gave would be, we'll go back to the crepe myrtle that we've talked about a few times. Is it worth the time, energy, and effort to do that for the benefit gained from a native? Or is it just best to just leave that mature tree alone, plant the native some other place? What's your comment on that?
I think it would also depend on how much area you have and how many trees you were going to plant. If you have a non-native tree there, but you can still plant, 5 trees in the area, I would just leave that non-native. It's still holding the soil together with its roots. I'm sure some bugs, they might not be native bugs, but some bugs are using it as a food source. It can be visually pleasing, so it does have its perks. I just wouldn't, it can be expensive to remove a tree. So I feel your pain on that. So I would say if you have the ability to still plant natives around, then that's fine. And if it's not feasible to take it down, my only concern would be if it was a species that seeded in a lot or had underground root systems. So if it was like an autumn olive or a tree of heaven that grows from underground shoots, that you definitely want to take down. And you can always like girdle a tree. I don't know if you know what that is, but you basically tie something around it and it can't function, and that'll kill it really slowly. And sometimes we do that in forest management because that'll leave a snag, which is a dead tree, and that can be home to a bunch of critters. So that's a cheaper way to kill a tree if you really wanted to get rid of it.
Thank you.
And then we just have one last question that I want to focus on because we're running out of time here. So I'm just going to bring it up, and I'm actually going to throw it at Josh because we have talked a lot about this with a multitude of people. The question is, would you suggest waiting to plant young trees after the cicadas are gone? Josh, so if you want to take that real quick.
We have cicadas every year. This year is a little bit different in that there's the Brood 10 coming out. The folks that we've talked to at the state level, at the county level, I think Craig Highfield, who you guys met the first night, even feels the same way. The guys that are coming out this spring, as they lay their eggs and kind of munch on the trees, are not going to do too much damage. These guys are going to be resilient. They'll be able to push through. So the cicadas are definitely something that's on our radar, but not necessarily something we're overly concerned about because it is something that's naturally occurring. Brittany, is there anything you want to add to that?
I agree with everything you're saying. I watched a couple webinars this week. And I don't know, I think they're going to be pretty resilient. It's not going to last that long. I know they do make netting, I think, that you can put over trees. If you had anything you were particularly concerned about, say you just like got this really expensive tree that you want to protect, wouldn't hurt, but I don't think there's going to be a big concern.
With the netting though too, that's another thought that has come out in conversations. It's all about a balancing act, right? If you're protecting an expensive tree or whatever, you need to think about snakes and other guys that can get caught in it. There's just, letting nature run its course might be the best idea unless it's a big investment. So it really comes down to what you're valuing and what's important. But that being said, we just hit 7:30, folks. So I think that's where we're going to end it tonight. If you have other questions or as this has been thought-provoking between now and next week, go ahead and email us your questions and we can see what we can do from there. But with that, everyone have a great evening and we'll see you soon. Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brittany.
Thanks, Brittany. Good night, all.